Yeah, there we go. Hi, this is Paul, and this is the third of our marriage crisis conversations. You can find the other two. There's a playlist that I have been developing over all the conversations, some of the sub conversations, like the Korean couple, the conversation I had with them. I don't know if you guys saw that, but I thought we've kind of fallen into a sort of every couple of weeks schedule here. We'll see if after we're done with this, we'll talk about the holidays and figure out how this goes after that. But in the meantime, the four of us do continue to sort of chat about this conversation and think about this conversation and marinate on it. And on one hand, this is a conversation between the four of us where we're exploring something, and all of you are watching, and so you're coming along with. And actually, just before I hit the record button, we did mention that, as I always say, I never end my videos with like and subscribe or hit the notification button, which is YouTube liturgy. I always say leave a comment, because the truth is that when you leave a comment, that tells us far more than liking or subscribing or hitting the notification button. And I plan at some point we're going to do some of these on StreamYard, so that there can be a comment section, and we'll get some live comments along the way, perhaps. But until then, your feedback as an audience is really vital for us, knowing if we're just talking amongst the four of us, which all four of us really enjoy, or if actually we're doing something that's helpful and productive for those of you out there who are watching. So I thought maybe this week again, Rod had written something in the interim, and I thought that might be a good place to start. So why don't you lead off with that, Rod?
Unintentionally, I've given myself homework here.
Joey would not be happy.
Yeah, I hate homework, but when it's voluntary, it doesn't feel like homework. And good news, we're all still married. So far, so good. Okay, let's see here. I brought it up. This is the email I sent you all. So the context was, I had just made kind of a passing comment about settling, and it was from a man's point of view. You know, what man really wants to feel like a woman settled for you, like you're sort of the last one standing kind of thing. I just made kind of a passing remark, and I really enjoyed, as she so often does, Catherine spoke up and said something that I didn't expect. It was really quite refreshing, but it got me thinking later. And so I kind of kept noodling on it, and I decided to write a few thoughts down. So yeah, here goes. The subject heading is settling for excellence. My brother and I spent countless hours of our childhood wandering the hills behind our house, armed with a pair of binoculars and Roger Torrey Peterson's Field Guide to Western Birds. And I thought of this, and I went into my bookshelf, and I actually found, I don't know if this is the original, but I might have just, in a moment of nostalgia, I might have picked it up at a bookstore or something, but here it is.
Wow.
This is the book. The book had wonderfully detailed illustrations of every bird you might discover high overhead, and we trained our eyes and ears to be on the lookout for the distinctive song or flash of color of a species we'd yet to identify. My childhood memory from those vivid illustrations, and before we got on here, I bookmarked it so you could see what I'm talking about.
Do you have a new camera, Rod? Your picture looks particularly crisp.
I don't know. I think it's the same camera, but it's daytime. It's not nighttime. So
oh, okay. Well, that could be.
Maybe it's just the light. Is it okay? Is it too crisp?
It looks good. No, light.
Do I need to exfoliate? So can you see this? So this is just
a little higher.
So this is an example.
Oh yeah.
Like these are orioles here, and you can see how brightly colored the males are, and then you see the females, right? And they tend to be. They all kind of look alike, actually. It's the males where you can really tell them apart. So the females are a lot more plain. And this is what I wrote. I said, I remember thinking how strange it was that humans seem to exhibit the opposite characteristics. It was the women who wore makeup, fancy clothes, lots of sparkling jewelry. From a child's simple logic, this never quite made sense. In our last conversation, Catherine said something, as I'm learning she often does, that was so simple, but upended my thinking on the subject. I was saying something about how corrosive it is to a man's psyche to realize that a woman had settled on him, implying he was the last one picked after she tried all the others. Her response changed the entire direction of the conversation. With some light editing, here is what she said. That sounds great. What's wrong with having someone settle for you? If you're willing to settle for me and stop searching around for the ideal that probably only exists in your head or in a magazine somewhere, and you would settle into my vision of marriage, which means we're committed, we're doing this thing, we're going to make it about more than just us, then I love it, because you're going to get attached to me, you're going to enjoy me. I'm going to make sure you have a great time. We're going to build a life together, and then you're not going to want to go anywhere. So I don't mind if you settle, because that's just the beginning. That's not the pinnacle I was trying to reach. We're just getting building at this point. And Eamon chimed in and said, Catherine and I have talked about when we initially got together, the different perspectives we came from, because I believe it was one of her relatives that said to her, you know, Catherine, you could have almost anybody you'd like. Why are you with him? Are you sure you want to do this? And we had a good laugh about that. And Catherine responded, it was my grandfather who's now passed. He married us. But what I told him was I picked him because I could have who I wanted, and I wanted him. I could, as a young woman, have found a guy who already had established himself and was well on his way in his career and had a house. And I was at a point in the sexual marketplace where I could have gone shopping, but building from the beginning what you're looking for, what will make a good husband, like what are the character traits, what are the qualities of someone that will make a good husband, and that's different. And I'm going to find somebody with established setup that I can just slip into. And I just wrote, I encourage the audience to go back and listen to that entire section. It starts about the 57-minute mark of our last conversation. I've been reflecting on this since then. At first, it was just a delightfully refreshing perspective. But as I thought more about it, I realized Catherine was modeling a very countercultural point of view, one worth more exploration. My first intuitions about Roger Tory Peterson's illustration all those years ago, showing the bright plumage of male birds, have of course been thoroughly discussed by evolutionary biologists. But to dramatically oversimplify, evolutionary adaptation has favored males who can demonstrate fitness, or you might say worthiness, to a potential mate. This simple fact acknowledged that the species wouldn't survive without females, and mate selection criteria favored males who could win the competition for female attention. As soon as Catherine described herself as the one picking Eamon, it stood out in stark contrast to the prevailing Western cultural norms, where heterosexual women will often go to great lengths to compete for male attention, often encountering a lackluster crop of increasingly ambivalent and non-committal men. My wife listened to our conversation and completely agreed with Catherine. In her younger years, she would have loved someone to settle on her. I realize this probably has a very gendered lens on it, because the idea of a woman settling for me deeply undermines my desire to win the prize. As a young man, I was inspired, at least in my own little corner of the universe, to make something of myself, to win the hand of the girl of my dreams. It was a significant driver of my ambition and the sacrifices I made to advance in the world. Perhaps the Disney effect is partly to blame here, and the romance novel before that. The fairy tale of the prince choosing the sleeping beauty is deeply subversive to the idea of a bright, self-actualized, fully capable woman choosing the man who will stand beside her through the vicissitudes of life. Yet pointing to Disney fairy tales seem quaint when compared to the hypersaturated media environment we all swim in today. Perhaps the constant bombardment of images on screens has hijacked men's predilection for visual attraction, forcing women into an arms race of self-objectification, setting off a spiraling feedback loop of women amplifying their attention-seeking displays as men increasingly fade into irrelevance. A society that recognizes women as the ultimate choosers, where boys are shaped into men who must make something of themselves to compete to be deserving of a high-quality woman, is a society that has pointed its compass toward a generative future. That's what I
now you wrote it 4 days ago. Any things percolate up since you've written it?
Yeah, all kinds of things. I've written all sorts of notes, but I want to make sure other people get a chance to chime in. So let's give them a chance to react to it, and then we'll see where we go with it.
One of the things that I saw immediately in this is the tension between settling and a hero's journey. I think often, Rod, when you and I have spoken about this, a lot of the framing I hear from you, at one point you made a comment about something about a man is waiting. You said it so well. It's waiting for a woman he can rescue. Something to that effect.
That what causes him to fall in love with her is that he sees that she needs him.
Yes, yes. And so the hero's journey is an aspect of this. Another theme that we've been talking about, that I continue to think about as I listen to the marriage conversation, is the degree to which the religious container, the participation and I guess part of what we're seeing, perhaps necessity of a religious container for marriage today, as to sort of withstand the disruption that technology is clearly bringing to the challenge. I listened to half of Chris Williamson's conversation with Louise Perry this morning, and her noting, of course, the disruption that the pill has been in terms of enabling women in some ways to have sex like a man, or to approach sex like a man would. And that's disruptive to, I think, this long tradition that you nicely lay out here, where there is sort of a dance between the sexes that is a very deep dance, and I think it's been a satisfying dance. The funny thing about dancing is that it's strenuous, and part of what the internet does is make the strenuous common. We don't go and watch people run we don't go and run a 4-minute mile. We watch them. We don't dance, we watch them. If we want to enjoy excellence of piano playing, we pull up Spotify or something on the internet and enjoy it. We don't go through the strenuous nature of learning it. And the participation in this dance that you lay out is a strenuous dance that has been disrupted. And I hear in this piece and in other aspects of our conversation a desire to once again participate in that, but it's sort of now been disrupted by the choice that, yeah, on one hand, for women, the pill offers to, well, part of that strenuous participatory dance for women was the very real possibility of pregnancy, multiple pregnancies, as Louise Perry said in that interview, being, so my wife and I have 5 children, and we look back, and between 1991, when my oldest was born, and 2000, when my youngest was born, a good bit of that time, my wife was either pregnant and often morning sick or postpartum. And so 9 years of her life. And then after that, of course, then now she has, 5 under 10. This is an extremely strenuous participation that now becomes optional. And that changes it.
and there's also this element of like, well, what are you choosing the other person for? You know, what's the telos? Um, that often goes unstated. People will have a desire for someone, but it's almost like the dog chasing the car, right? And when I talk to I've talked to many men who were like that, and sort of in the therapist role where they're like, they don't know what they want to do. They're just kind of really like chasing. And with I guess it goes to the autobiographical a bit here. I was in a relationship for about a year and a half with someone who was really wonderful in many ways. And part of why the relationship didn't work was, the telos we each of us had in mind it wasn't that interesting to me, if I'm being just really frank. Not that it was a bad one. There was nothing immoral about it. It was fine, but it was divergent. And with Catherine, one of the things that struck me right away was, oh, she has, I mean, it didn't end up working. The plan didn't end up happening, but she had one of, she wanted to go to medical school. And the idea was she wanted to step into a place of service towards others. And for me, it was like, oh, there's alignment in values. Like there's a mission, there's an endpoint. And so I knew I wanted that too. I grew up in a home where purpose was talked about a lot. And when my parents would talk about their marriage, they would talk about what is the marriage for. And my dad's always been deeply involved in the community in the region here. He was mayor for 7 years in Dryden here. And so that was always at the forefront, that there's a larger purpose. And for me with Catherine, it was like she wants to serve other people. The goal of medicine is outward focused. And there was a practical nature to that. And that I could agree that helping people that way is good. And then there was, as a Christian as well, a larger picture as well, that I thought, this is really exciting. I like this. And if I'm going to join my life with her and hers with mine, there's a shared endpoint that's beyond us, which, for, almost 18 years now, I mean, has really carried us. It's looked different than we anticipated, rather than being a medical goal. It's been through, therapy and counseling and that kind of thing. But that really bound us together. And for me, it was, yeah, I'm on board. We can talk about a shared vision. And the marriage was a vehicle for more than just, hey, we really like each other, even though we really do enjoy being with one another. And that's shaped us over time as well, where decisions we've made, there's disagreements about how and when, but big picture, we're aiming at generally the same things. And that gives the relationship, it's not only a binding agent, but it propels it forward as well. It's not a marriage agreement. We look at each other and go, oh, well, okay, so we're together, so I guess we'll watch Netflix again tonight. And that's kind of it. That's what we do, right? It's, and we do enjoy watching Netflix together. Don't get me wrong. But there's fuel. It's headed somewhere. And, I guess it's like riding a bike. If you have some momentum, it's easier to stay upright and to keep moving forward than if, and you have to be headed somewhere, right? And what do they say when you're learning to ride a motorcycle? One of the first things they say is, wherever you're looking, that's where you're going to go. So don't look down at your feet. Don't look at the things you don't want to hit, or else you're going to trash this motorcycle. Look to where you want to go. And if you're looking in the same direction, broadly speaking, especially far down the road, that keeps you balanced, and that keeps you from wiping out. And that's been a major theme in our relationship. And it's hard for me to think of the marriage crisis in the West and decouple that from the moral relativism that's out there, and the death of a grand narrative within the culture itself. So, and I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I think it ups the degree of difficulty when you don't have those overarching values directed at something. When you pull that away, it's difficult. And people that have good marriages that are not Christians that I know, I have found every time, I'm not saying these don't exist, but every time they have had shared big picture goals together. And that's kept them bound together when you move beyond the, hey, you look really hot stage of the relationship. So that what are you selecting the person for is what came to mind reading your email, Rod, and has been a place that I've come back to often. And when I'm doing marriage counseling with couples, that's often what I'm thinking is, okay, if this relationship's going to work, what is binding them together? What is the purpose of this relationship? What are they aiming at together? Because if there's some overlap there, I can appeal to that, and that will be a binding agent for them in their marriage. And if that's not there, then, or we can't identify it, I'm focusing a lot of my energy on trying to find what those things are, even if they're really, really tiny, and hoping we can build off of that.
And to Paul's point, the introduction of the pill really dysregulated that system, because before, automatically one of the things you would be selecting for would be, the qualities of a husband. Do they have the nature that you would want to have in your children? Is their family support structure going to be facilitative of a secure family? Does their family get along with your family? Because you would likely have children with that person, it built in all this other baseline stuff, because part of the telos would be family together, life together, children together, as inherent in being together, which has been decoupled in modern society. Those don't have to go together, so you don't have a built-in telos.
Mm-hmm.
If I was going to summarize the point that I was making with that little email, I was trying to capture something about something that you're doing in these conversations, Catherine, that really stands out. And particularly someone who's sort of been in that world of dating and sitting across from somebody at a dinner table, trying to sort of make sense of each other. I'm sure it comes naturally to you, but it stands in a very stark contrast to the posture that a lot of people have adopted, even the people who are trying to play the game, relatively in good faith, right? You're taking the measure of each other. It's very oppositional. It's war out there for so many people. Mm. And what I was really noticing is it's not just the kind of warmth and agreeableness and all that that's nice, but it's also a very clear-minded approach. Like, you were very clear about what it was you were trying to do. I'm sure in hindsight you can see that you were still young like anybody, and you probably, some of your ideas have mellowed or marinated over time, because we all do that. But you had a pretty clear idea of what it was you were trying to accomplish, and you wanted and needed a man to do that, right? And so one of the things that really comes across, I don't want to speak for you, but it seems like you actually really like men, and you really like, you like what you can do with them, you can see something quite positive and generative, and you're optimistic about it, and you have this kind of, generous spirit about it. And so that's one thing. And the other thing was, and I, just to make sure I made the point, it was that actually my sort of childhood oversimplification of like, why are the male birds so bright and shiny and the female birds are sort of not, well, actually, it's still that way. Men still have to demonstrate, right, value, right? It's just, we don't necessarily do it with colorful clothes or whatever. But we are still being evaluated all the time by our capacity to, to perform, essentially to self-sacrifice, to provide resources, that in the manosphere, they'll say something like women just are and men have to become, right? They'll say something like that, right? That in order to sort of be worthy of a woman, you have to sort of make something of yourself first. And in that sense, it's probably a lot like the biological world, where men are showing that they have resources and that they're fit, right? So yeah, that's what I was trying to bring attention to. I was trying to bring attention to how different that is than what it's like out there. And now your comment about a telos, Eamon, I'm gonna sort of take a little detour for a second.
Sure.
But I hope it will be relevant. So in the new, it's in this country, in the news, we just passed this high profile legislation where Congress voted to concretize same-sex marriage, and I think also interracial marriage. That seems political. I mean, it seems like that was obviously okay for a very long time. So I'm not sure, and even same-sex marriage has been legalized for a while. So, it feels a little bit ceremonial, a bit political. But, fair enough. And I'll speak only for myself here, but I'm in favor of that. I'm in favor of people having the freedom to ceremonialize and make official their committed relationships. So I don't, I'm a product of the age, and I don't have a problem with people, making official the commitments they've made privately. So what we're doing is we're increasing the aperture of what is allowed when we say married, right? Like we're basically making it a more accepting and permissive and allowing structure. So it isn't just, between a monogamous relationship between a man and a woman. It's a broader definition, right? And I think most people feel comfortable with that and feel like that's probably the right thing to do. But the other side of that, and this goes back to the comment, maybe it was the last conversation where we were talking about Jordan Peterson getting in trouble for describing enforced monogamy, right? There was this forcing function that marriage used to have, and Paul, your comment about Louise Perry, the other thing she said about the introduction of the pill was the dramatic decline of the shotgun marriage, right? That was a forcing function. Dad on the porch with a shotgun. You were expected to get married, and in some cases, you were forced to get married. Marrying somebody, like for example, if you got a woman pregnant, it was expected that you would marry her, right? Like that was part of the deal. And so there was this other side of it, which is that you had to do it, right? Now, we're living in a world where nobody can make anybody do anything. This is kind of my comment from the last one, right? If other than paying my taxes and driving on the right-hand side of the road, what exactly do I owe anybody, right? If anybody is free to go at any time, then there really is no forcing function. That part is gone, right? And as a person who likes my independence and autonomy, I'm not necessarily mourning that. I wouldn't want people telling me how I could live my life, right? So most of the at least the legislative piece and really the cultural piece is people are free to do what they want to do, theoretically, as long as they don't hurt anybody else, right? I mean, you could argue about that. There's a tragedy of the commons going on there, where lots of people are getting hurt, but maybe not, maybe they don't have anybody they can blame for it, right? So what we're left with is only voluntary, we're emphasizing allowing people who want to be able to formalize their relationship, right? That's what we're emphasizing. And I'm in favor of that, right? In that environment, the only thing you have left is to make it really, really appealing, right? So the back to your telos, Amy. Maybe that's another way of saying what you're saying, which is if you're not in a faith tradition, if you're just a secular person and you're contemplating, as a man, you're contemplating, I'm never going to sleep with another woman again in my life, right? Like this is it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is, I mean, any other women.
Or maybe the first.
Hopefully not that. Yeah.
A lot of sexless marriages out there.
Oh yeah, I'm glad somebody else said that. So the telos sort of implies this kind of, some greater good, some project you're working on together, right? Something, right? And of course, I'm in favor of that. I'm absolutely in favor of that. But for the most part, what marriage is now is just all downside and not a lot of upside, right? So that's why what Catherine was doing is like, oh, wait a minute. Here's a person who is in position to be choosing, and she's using the power she has to make a choice, and she's doing it enthusiastically, and she's happy with her choice, right? Like, what a concept, right? So I don't know how well I described what I was trying to say when that's what stood out to me.
Yeah, my mind keeps going to the unstated goals and assumptions that are there, because as much as it's about people should be free to choose what they want, and I agree with that too. I think that I don't particularly like the idea of people being forced into relationships. There is so much that really is unstated. Like even with the manosphere, the comment there about like, oh well, men have to achieve and women get to be. I'm like, if we're talking about sex, sure. If we're talking about a man making a commitment, no. It's what are we talking about in the manosphere? And this is my oversimplification. It seems to mostly be about how to get laid. Like, I think that's mostly what it's about. And it's not said, like occasionally it is, but that's a lot of it. And that doesn't mean that there isn't value coming from that corner. Like I think understanding attraction and I think in some ways, if you utilize what they're saying well, is how do you keep there being sort of some spice in your sex life with your spouse? Like there's and to be thinking about why do I not have anyone interested in me? I think that's useful.
And I think the more mature side of the manosphere, where there's some anger around a lack of paternal rights over children.
Yes, that makes sense too. Because it really touches on things that are, I think, destabilizing our entire society. They focus on that too. To these unstated assumptions, like I have a hard time. Back to the last conversation, the comment about psychology, is to the West as Islam is to the Middle East. If you look at all of the ethical guidelines, code of ethics for every psychological group, be it APA, CPA, looking at the state level, the provincial level, what is at the very top of that hierarchy of values? It is always patient autonomy. No matter what is going on, you do not violate patient autonomy unless it is directly going to lead to someone being killed or them being killed. And there was this quote, this was like in the 70s when there was a lot more thought in psychology about implicit values. I can't remember the psychologist's name, but he was criticizing his own field, saying, basically, in a nutshell, psychologists and psychiatrists really need to be thoughtful about their assumptions because they go unstated, because otherwise we are being crypto missionaries for a particular worldview. And when we're not clear about that, because so much of early psychology was about being completely neutral, and so it's what does the client want, what does the patient want, that there's a whole worldview that's in that. And so being crypto missionaries, I'm like, well, it happened because our law is based around that. How we think about relationships is based around that. We have a hierarchy that's at the top. And what do we have? We have a culture that's very heavily influenced by psychology and psychotherapy. And what are you taught? Well, what do you want? You should be free to do what you like. And that then informs marriage therapy, couples therapy, individual therapy. And you can't get away from it. But yet there isn't a lot of consciousness, I think, even amongst a lot of psychologists about how that operates. There's a reason why, unfortunately, his name eludes me at the moment, why he felt like he needed to write that and say, look, we are shaping things. We are shaping law. We are shaping people and values. And this will have downstream effects. So, are we going to be self-conscious about that? Because we are missionaries. And I think, yeah, we are. And now here we are 50 years later. And of course, that's being played out with marriages and male-female relationships and then families too. And my last point, I'll step aside, that being free to leave at any moment, if you know about attachment theory, what is that going to create? A really, really deeply insecure attachment style. If you can leave at any moment, how can I not be anything but either the three manifestations of a attachment style that's not secure? It's either I'm going to cling to you, I'm going to pretend I'm not interested in you and keep you away, or I'm going to oscillate between the two. I'm going to cling to you and then push you away. And that is what I see in marriages. And we have set the stage for the insecure attachment to reign supreme. We're enticing it, we're calling it forth into relationships with that environment.
This is such an important topic. Paul, we're filming at a different time, and I'm noticing that I'm about to be bathed in sunlight because the sun's coming in. So I'm gonna, maybe you've just push pause for a second, and I can.
Final thought. So actually, one last thought there is, where it's pretty well established that your family of origin is going to affect you, and ideally, as a child, your parents' marriage is very secure, and that's how you go out and you explore. You explore from the secure base that is going to be there. You can try things, maybe you get hurt, you get beat up, but you come back to home base and you know that it's there. And we're now a few generations on into children growing up in homes where their parents are primed for insecure attachment, because there's, like you were saying, Rod, you have to maintain being enticing, or else they're going to leave you. And for people who are even, a little bit neurotic, you're going to be thinking about that. Am I still a good deal because he or she could leave at any moment? And then that is home base for those kids who then now carry that from their family of origin into that environment that is going to create that negative feedback loop of insecurity. And away we go, right?
I feel so strongly that this is, it's like we're trying to talk about marriage and we're saying how hard that is to get our arms around. And you just pointed to what this is really about, I think. which is secure attachment, right? And human beings are social creatures. We need touch. We need to be seen and heard. We need to belong. We need to be able to find our place within a community. And the most irreducible unit of value and all of those things is, I think, a family, right? And so we just took a very hard subject and just made it way harder, because now we have to go upstream. We have to find the sort of emotional headwaters of the cascading multi-generational effect that you're describing. Yet if you want this to get better, you're going to have to figure out a way to create stable, secure homes where children grow up, modeling healthy relationships and secure attachments, and where they get their emotional needs met, and they come into the world with healthy expectations of the opposite sex and so forth. I mean, there's so much. I mean, how on earth do you fix that, right? But I agree with you. This is inevitably where you end up in this conversation. You have to at least wrestle with the multi-generational trauma of abandonment and separation. And as you say, the intermittent, the clinging and abandoning. Sometimes I think this kind of existential anger that you hear so often coming from women, my first reaction to it is I have a huge amount of empathy for so many of them, because there's obviously pain underneath this. And you can almost picture the child standing in the driveway as dad drives off for the last time.
Mm-hmm.
And just the raw pain and emptiness and anger, and you want to just pound on his chest and tell him how much you hate him, and you want him to stay and hold you and hug you tighter, not leave, right? Mm-hmm. And yet there's just so many people who have been so traumatized by this. Anybody's free to go at any time. I don't know what you do about that exactly, but I do think that a public conversation about it is long overdue.
Well, this I think leads to one of the real weaknesses of psychology too, because we like to have an algorithm, and this is an observation, not a political statement. The psychologists tend to lean heavily left, and with that there is a focus on environment, which is certainly a large part of the equation. But trying to muck about with only externals leaves you unable to explain a lot of things, including, I think, one of the reasons I feel strongly about this is my own family. Parents, both from broken homes, and I have a very secure attachment, and it's because, despite what they went through, my dad, and like I said in our first talk, was just like, I want to be stable, because I know what it's like to be in a home that's unstable. So I'm going to be as stable as I can be. And I want that for my kids, because I don't want them to go what I've gone through. And, other people will go the other route, right? Where it's like, well, I know what that's like, so I'm just not going to commit ever. And unless you're talking at that individual level as well, I think you end up either trying to engineer society and ruining it even more. Because what usually happens when you try to fix something you don't understand. And you rob yourself of being able to speak to that person. I think that's why Jordan Peterson is sort of interesting as a psychologist, and why there's not a lot of psychologists like him, because he is profoundly interested in the individual, and is also looking to intervene at the level of the individual. It's concerned about societal things, but psychologists, at least a lot of the ones that I know, they will talk about they're interested in individuals, but they're really, the agenda is to re-engineer society when it comes down to it. And that doesn't mean I don't think there should be interventions at that level. I think those are important. And if you miss those macro factors, then people are going to be a mystery to you, and you're probably going to end up being really judgmental and harsh on them if you see them only as an individual. But the tilt seems to be really far left in the in focus on environment from the psychological world, and that's where a lot of the evolutionary psych comes from as well.
And just to clarify, you mean focus on the environment as in it's the environment that caused
That's
this
determinative
problem,
ultimately.
as opposed to the internal engagement up with the environment, which
Yeah.
tends to lean more on the right-hand side of the spectrum.
Yeah, so seeing it as you got to contend with both, and if you contend only with one, it's trouble. And I would say that in a lot of churches, the tendency is to focus so much on the individual that you can crush people who, they're up against far more than you would ever know or understand, even if they told you what they've been up against. And I think that's part of the disconnect is, the polarization really hurts everybody between right and left, because they both have answers within them that are important. And psychology is uniquely positioned, but I think in a lot of ways dropping the ball. And it manifests itself, of course, at that fundamental level of a family, right? And male-female dynamics, and then, more broadly speaking, marriage as a way of binding people together.
As a pastor, I often see people who could use a little therapy. When I was in seminary, one of the main things that they hammer into you in seminary is you are not a psychologist, so don't play one in your church. And what that means as a seminarian, you sort of like, well, I'm not quite sure where the lines are. So then you, in the process, you begin to learn where the lines are. Here's psychology over here. These are some of the things that can help. Here's pastoral care, church ministry. This should be your focus. I am often reticent to send couples in unhappy marriages to psychologists, because in almost every case, the result will be the end of the marriage, even if it's couples therapy. Because what I have seen is that the psychologist is committed to the well-being. Now, that well-being is framed, the well-being of the patient. And in many cases, whatever is driving, or at least part of what is driving some of that lack of well-being, is getting manifest in the marriage. And the easiest way to remove the irritant is to remove the spouse. And, all of and then of course, and this is almost a cliche, they then very quickly go out into the world and find someone else, and the whole story repeats itself. But this to Eamon's point, that there are implicit values in there that in some ways the church leans on this and says, yes, we want your individual welfare, but we also want the welfare of the unit and the children. And of course, we talked a little bit in the last one, Kramer versus Kramer in the 1970s, the kids will be all right. And then by the 1990s, a little bit more study said, well, maybe they won't be. And by now 2020s, it's like, go into my randos conversations. And I always listen for it. Listen for the marriages that broke up and the children shuffling, shuttled back and forth, maybe. And the randos conversations that make it onto my channel are, maybe more than half, but many of the randos conversations that don't make it to my channel, much more get stuck in there in terms of this question of attachment. Because how can I trust an unseen God if I couldn't really trust my parents? And that then comes into, and the key thing here is that, back to the marriage equality conversation, for a generation now, a gay couple might get married as a sort of political act. But what has happened in the hetero community is that marriage, people don't marry until they decide we want to have children together. And those tend, and then there's a class element of this too. Those tend to be middle and upper class who have all sorts of advantages, usually come from better homes, have better education, have better, are in a better situation financially. And the article that I posted on Twitter and got some really interesting pushback from that I just put in our little group chat. The New York Times comes out this week with who will care for kinless seniors. And one of the lines that popped out to me was, because again, I work with a lot of seniors. One of the things actually coming to the Christian, last year was same-sex marriage. Next year is, can the retirees in the Christian Reformed Church only get married in the church, thus sanctioning their sexual life, and not get married in the eyes of the state, thus threatening estates and retirement benefits that would be jeopardized by a new partner? Because many, actually, I would say in the Christian Reformed Church, there are an increasing number of seniors who are cohabitating, living together, shacking up, living in sin, all that church language with respect to this. And the church basically looks the other way because they're not going to have children, and marriage is about children. And exactly what you said, Rod, and what you said, Eamon, the ethos of the culture is nobody's going to tell you what to do. And in many respects, churches have been sort of cowed into, we have to take that posture with people.
And I would say that one of the other interesting sort of disjuncts between the church and the psychological world too is you can have a principle you aspire to, but if you can't operationalize that into a process, yeah, especially something as complex as a marriage, you're in trouble. Like, I would say that, like you were saying, Paul, about pastors are like, you're not a psychologist, don't step into that. The church will often have principles that it points to for you. This is what makes a good marriage. But people are a mess. And it's like, well, how do you get there? And if you don't have a way of saying this is the process towards being a good husband or a good wife or a parent, people are floundering. People are really, deeply struggling. It's like, yeah, maybe I want to do that, but I can't, and I don't know why. And you sort of left with two options, right? You either conclude, well, I guess I'm just so messed up that there's no way that I can actually reach what this ideal or goal is. And you just despair, or maybe you get angry and you lash out, or you go, these principles are garbage. This is stupid. So I'm done with that. And then on the psychological side of it, I mean, we do breaking things down into small pieces and identifying the process really well. But the underlying assumptions and the telos isn't always clear. So you give people these tools, but what are they aspiring to? Well, I can't really say. I shouldn't tell you. You get to decide what you want individually, and you get to decide as a couple, and you're just sort of left to figure that out. And so, where do these meet? With, I guess, the caveat being that what's implied on the psychological side are all these values of you do what you want, you do what makes you happy, you need to be free at all moments, all the time. And that's what I will help you accomplish at the end of the day. So, and then to add one more layer, you're using these words and who knows what they mean. I was talking to a client recently, and she was recently divorced, and now is talking about getting remarried. And so the conversation eventually goes to like, so what are you looking for? And she said, well, I don't want anybody who's romantic at all. I hate that stuff. And I was like, okay, well, tell me what you mean.
Click on previous conversation.
Yeah. And here what she says, she goes, well, when somebody's romantic, what that means is like they'll buy you flowers or something like that, but they're really lazy in bed, and she just goes on to describe like the most horrible person. And I said, I don't think that's what romantic means. This is somebody pretending to be romantic, and they think that they can dupe you if they give you flowers. And I, described a little bit what I think generally people mean by romantic, in terms of attention, being thoughtful, honoring the other person, being attentive to their needs. And she said, "Oh well, I would like that actually." I said, "Well, so maybe romance is a decent thing." And then another one was, "Oh, I don't want anybody who's always checking up on me. I don't want anyone who's going to check up on me at all to see how I'm doing." And I was like, okay, again, let's break it down. What do you mean? Because I'm thinking like, I kind of like it if Catherine's like, oh, you said you were going to be here at 8:30. It's 9 o'clock, and it's like, oh, she's thinking about me. She's not like, oh, good, he's late. I get a little more time, a little more me time. And you break it down with her. It's like she describes a really controlling relationship where it was like, who are you with? Why aren't you back now? Are you seeing someone else? And I said, well, again, when I think of checking up on, it's like somebody's concerned for your well-being. And if you're not there, they want to make sure you're not in the ditch or, you're in a car accident or something. And again, her response was, oh, no, well, no, that's actually really nice. And, like, okay, so when we're talking about marriage, and we're talking about relationships, what are people hearing? I mean, that's one of the things you're confronted with all the time as a psychologist is we're talking about your marriage. Even if we're talking about sex, I hear horrible things when for how some people define the difference between sex and like rape or sexual abuse. Their definitions of these things are really different. So if we're talking about getting married or whatever, they're just hearing like, what you want me to do what, and it's like, man, this is like you said, Rod, this gets really complex, and that's at the most fundamental level, and the result of insecure attachment 3, 4, 5, 6 generations in, and the way people react when they feel insecure in a relationship, to control, to push away, to get angry and bully, or to become really codependent and need to make you happy all the time. But it's it gets so that we're even defining things becomes really challenging. And if you're going to set up ideals, in a culture that is very pluralistic, that's hard. Now let's operationalize it, and let's get a process that we can help people identify and work through. And away we go.
But operationalizing anything requires definitions and shared goals.
Yes.
That's the definition of operationalizing. You're
Yeah.
heading somewhere together.
Yeah.
And the thing you hear all the time is the implicit purpose of marriage I hear in the culture is marriage should make me happy.
Yeah.
And I think I certainly want you to be happy. And I would love for your marriage to make you happier than if you weren't married. But I don't think that's the vehicle for that. And I'm committed to, asserting the goodness of marriage. And which is why it's the religious people, someone like Tim Keller, who has the audacity to write a book where he basically openly says, marriage isn't there to make you happy. Marriage is there to make you good and possibly great.
Okay, I got to bite on that because I'm trying to make sure I leave room for Catherine to talk here too. So
She'll talk. I'm not worried about Catherine.
So, okay, I'm a typical millennial or Zoomer, and I hear the horror stories. I hear all, Kramer versus Kramer. People just walking away from their children and my ex will take care of them. we watch that now, we're like, what are they thinking? Like at the time it's some act of empowerment. Now we're like, what are you doing? Like, how could you possibly, right?
Mhm.
And you might think, well, okay, well, then maybe people who have children, we don't let them get divorced, right? Or something like that. But, you know, sorry, you gotta stay together at least until the kids are grown or something. And then the answer is, well, how about we just don't do that? How about we don't get married at all? How about we don't have kids? Like I'll save you a lot of trouble, right? I'll save myself a lot of trouble. I just won't do it at all, right? And the article that you shared, Paul, so if it's not to make me happy, by the way, I agree with you. Well, the article you shared is, you know, this concern about all these kinless folks are going to grow old and have nobody to take care of them, basically, right? Well, is that what marriage is for? So marriage is so I'll have somebody to be around when I'm old? Well, that sounds great, right? I mean, I can see
That's
why.
what kids are for too.
Right. I can see why I would want that, but how do they feel about it? Right. So it made me think of the conversation you had with the Korean couple, which was lovely. They were lovely. But if you actually paid attention, they were describing an approach to marriage. I mean, basically it was sort of an updated version of an arranged marriage, right? And both of them seemed to be quite intentional about what it was that they were getting married for, right? And you know, you'll hear people say it's the most important decision of your life, right?
Mhm.
I agree with that. But listen carefully when you say that. Well, haven't you already started instrumentalizing the other person? You've already started the process of evaluating what they can do for you, right? So all of this, the whole conversation is in one way or another. Now, the reality is, I think, I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist. I both what I read and what I understand, for most of its history, marriage was a relatively pragmatic institution. It was about property, it was about lineage, you know, legacy, and things like this. Romantic notions seem to be more modern about, you know, love and self-expression and all these other ideas. But I don't see how on earth we will ever get back to selling marriage as, well, you don't want to be alone when you're old, do you? Right? If it becomes a transaction, well, then you've lost the enchantment altogether, right? And if the enchantment has to remain, like as soon as you state it, this is kind of like what we talked about the first time we talked, Paul, publicly, was, you know, this idea, as soon as you spell it out, you degloss it, right? Like, well, here's what I'm looking for. And then you say what it is. And then if you get it, well, you should be happy, right? You got what you wanted, right? But so much of human relationships is about something entirely different. It's about bonding. It's about belonging. It's about caring, right? And I'm just not sure that you redeem marriage by scaring people into it, or, you know, all the other ways, right? Because my answer to that, if I'm a sort of a typical millennial, is I'm going to be like, well, I'll save you all a whole lot of trouble. I just won't do it, right? No problem, right? No divorce, no abandoned children, right? And if you get married, you can't get divorced if there are children, or you start trying to make it more of a forcing function, well, the next thing people can do is just opt out, right? So it's not like it helps marriage to make it more onerous, right? So I just don't know how we get out of this unless we make it more beautiful somehow. We re-enchant it somehow. Sorry, please. Go, Kat.
I think the answer is you have to push further into that problem. You have to push further in, and you say, okay, then what's the point of life? Like, why are you here? What do you want to do with your life? And if, like, there's only a few answers to that question, right? Like, there's only a few answers. So why, like, what's the point of being alive at all? Well, to experience everything. I want to see all the things and do all the things. It's like, okay, well, why? Why do that? It's like, well, I think that will make me happy. Like, okay, how long will that make you happy for? Most people, you can do some of that, but it takes money, you know, unless you're in the top, like, tiny, tiny sliver of people. we're talking what, like a week a year where you get to go see the Taj Mahal or something, and you're going to suffer for all the other weeks of the year for that. That's what's worth living. Like, okay, that's one answer. Like, I want to see the things and experience the world. And even then, the underlying assumption is because there's something good there to experience and see, right? There's a good thing there that I want to go get access to. And seeing that beauty, or that, you know, riding that motorcycle on that mountain, that's worth all the pain because that experience is so good. That's one answer. The other answer is I want a little more psychopathy, but I want control. There's all these people around me. I can make them do what I want. And I enjoy making people do what I want. Like, I like that. It makes me feel powerful. And that feeling of power is worth living for, no matter what the result is. Like, I don't care, but I like this feeling. Okay. Then there's family. There's human connection. There's familial, friendly, warmth, connection, which is what most people land on. It's like, I'm here because I love people, and it's kind of jaggedy and broken and there's rough parts and whatever. But, you know, I hear people all the time. It's like, well, my cousin killed himself. I've thought about killing myself. But the reason I don't is because of my nieces and nephews, because of my kids, because of my mom. The reason I'm willing to stick through the suffering and the pain of life is because of people I love, and I don't want them to suffer more. And maybe someday I could have my own kids, and it kind of gets fuzzy at that point, even, because it's like, oh, that's too big of a thing to hope for, that I would have people that love me the way I love my mom. That's too much to hope for. But you know, I can be here for my nephews, and so a lot of people will land on family. Like, we really are social. Like, we're very deeply social. So it's like experience, connection, power, which is also money, right? Power and money, like, that's the same category. There's not a lot of other answers to that existential question. And so
that's where I think your functional anthropology means a lot. Like, if you think, it's one thing if you think that people are generally awful, you're probably not going to get married or want to have any. And if you think that people are just awesome, they're just fantastic, and yeah, they have their issues, they have their problems, you're going to view being married and having kids and grandkids and all of that in a very different way as well. You know, I think the darkness that is there about just humans and human nature. I mean, I find it disturbing, the kind of movies that are generally put out and the stories that people are drawn to. And it's like, yeah, it's like people have had real traumas, and it's like they're drawn back to things that reaffirm that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I get to see the dark side of human nature. I know people can be really, really awful. Thankfully, I think that there are more people who aren't than who are. And right. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go finish your thought.
And that, I mean, I think my kids are great. I think my wife's great. I meet people. I really like my clients. I think that they're awesome. Sometimes they're referred to me because it's part of their parole. But I see, you know, delightful things in them, and I see a battle going on, and I see that there's a part of them that's drawn towards things that are really awful. There's a part of them that's drawn to things that are good, and so the thought of human connection and flourishing and being in a family and having access to, you know, forming somebody else and seeing what they can become, I find that invigorating and exciting.
So I think, for whatever good this is, I think that part of this is an issue with urbanization, because I think the difference you're describing is the difference between seeing people as vegetables in the grocery store to choose versus plants that are growing. You know, you get used to an environment where it's like what you choose, that's the finished product. It's lifeless, right? It's cut off. And even people, you get the facade. It's like, I'm at work, you're getting my work front, you know. You don't have chickens and goats that you like raise from babies and then butcher and eat later. Like you're not in a system that is a living, organic, moving, growing system.
Static.
it's this, I'm choosing the product, and that is the product that I have. And then the emphasis goes on you to be a savvy consumer. You know, are you choosing the right attributes? Are you putting things in you that will be life-giving, instead of thinking of yourself as a part of a larger
system? And,
system?
oh, how am I going to get these carrots to really grow?
Yeah.
I want to know if Eamon's a chicken or a goat. That's what I want to know.
When you were talking about the shows that people are drawn to, it made me think of something kind of funny. Because I do think you're sort of dividing the world into people who think people are great and people who think people aren't great. You can hardly blame them. Anybody who's on social media, you can't blame them for going away with the impression that people can be really disappointing at minimum. We're just, of course, the algorithms are amplifying all of that. But we have a joke, my wife and I, because we're constantly getting the recommendations of the shows that everybody's watching. Or it's White Lotus right now, but it's this has been going on for years, right? And remember Breaking Bad, or Game of Thrones, or right, all the shows that everybody was watching. Handmaid's Tale, and we'll get like halfway through one of these episodes of like, this is really dark. It's like we like to watch like English gardening shows, or like the BBC mysteries. I particularly like the ones where the murder's already happened. Like I don't have to see that. I can just, now we're just going to solve it, right? Like I don't want to go to bed with like these kind of images in my head, right? And I'm always mystified by why is it that so many people love these terrible shows, like people just acting terribly, right? And it made me think of something just recently. So one of our shows that we like is the original Antiques Roadshow, the British version, the BBC version of it. And it's been going on for like 40 years or more, right? So it's an old show, and there's lots of reruns. And there's something interesting about that show. So part of the fun of it is trying to figure out what the thing is worth, right? So people are bringing in particular when you're in England, there's a lot of old stuff there, right? So like there are things from like, the 1300s, you're like, and you can't believe I could get that for like 300 pounds. Like, I mean, just because it's so old, I'd want it, right? It's sort of weird. And then you have something which, has obvious sentimental value, but doesn't have a lot of market value. In other cases, it's like just outlandishly valuable. And that's what makes it fun, right? But there's something about that. So, usually the people will say, well, we're not selling it. It's like, it's part of the family lore and blah, 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 right?
Yeah. Sometimes
Sometimes they just found it in an antique shop and they need the money. But so what the show is doing is showing you the difference between sentimental value, let's call it, right? Family history, whatever, and the market value, which is essentially collectors who've decided what's in fashion right now, right? So there'll be these weird kind of bubbles where everybody decides they want this particular thing, and all of a sudden it's really valuable, and then 20 years later it's not so valuable. And so it made me think of, this is another way of thinking about what we're talking about, right? Is like the marketplace is not particularly good at valuing, particularly, I mean, it's one thing with art, because art is also a very inefficient market, for all the FOMO thing, like people, something like hot, everybody wants it. But these are sort of artifacts, so it's more than art, right? These are many times they're military medals from great grandfather or what, like, so a lot of times what we're looking at is, it's not just its aesthetic value, it's also like its historic value and its value to that particular family. And so one of my sort of little musings, you walk through these antique stores and thrift shops, every once in a while you'll see one of these big, beautiful oil painted portraits of somebody, right? And it's like, so now imagine the sequence of events, because sometime, 3 generations ago, somebody sat for that portrait, spent a lot of money probably, and was very proud of it, put it over the Davenport, right? And then here I am looking at it in an antique shop somewhere. It's like, so whose grandmother is that? Right?
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, like, if you buy it, what do you tell people if you hang it in your house? Like, I don't even get, like, who's that? Oh, that's just nobody. That's just something I found in an antique shop, right? So there's something about that world that sort of highlights the difference, the way we think about value, right? Like the monetary thing, and then there's this other thing. And maybe that's a decent analog for what you're trying to get at, Catherine, right? Because there's this other thing, which we obviously value, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to a marketplace, right?
Well, it's like the guy who's like talking about how his wife is beautiful and everyone thinks that she looks like a linebacker, but you know, she's beautiful to him. And
God for
that's
her.
great. Or, you know, what does she see in him? And it's like, well, it's because it's my wife, it's my husband, it's my child, it's my baby. And yeah, to you, it wouldn't make any sense, but there's that.
Now,
That the
back,
person's an artifact. Sorry.
so go ahead, Catherine.
But it's that gets broken when you have issues with attachment.
Bingo.
Yeah.
As I was just about to say. Thank you. Exactly.
Yeah.
You lose your faith in people.
Yeah, you lose your faith. And I really resonated, Rod, when you were saying that that was a conversation that you see as extremely important, because I agree. I think that is central. And I think that you can address attachment issues.
Mhm.
I think that to do so, you have to have a vision for what that could look like. You have to have the willingness to do a lot of struggling personally to be able to shift it in yourself and for the next generation. Because if you're somebody with attachment issues, it's very painful to try to attach well to other people.
Yeah.
It creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of distress. As you move forward through it, it's not just the initial parts of like starting to attach to somebody that's hard. Then there's all kinds of anxiety that you have to face because there's fears of the attachment moving away. And then you have to face sort of grieving and anger about the fact that you didn't get that when you were younger.
Mhm.
So it's possible, but it is an extended process that requires guidance, support. What were you going to say, Brad?
And everything is riding on that relationship, because you're also not nested in a family or a village or an extended community. So it's not just that you're on tenterhooks about managing the connection. It's that if it fails, you lose everything, right? Because you don't have all the other context that you
Mhm.
might have had in another time.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, often people who have those attachment issues, addiction gets wrapped in.
Yeah.
Because you have a very uncomfortable relationship with reality, and addictions usually exist because they help you escape reality for a little while. And so, it could be alcohol and drugs, but it could also be shopping. It could be, pornography, whatever. There's also usually some kind of unhealthy, unhelpful coping mechanism as well that you're trying to fight against at the same time.
That also buffers you from other people and creating a secure attachment, like
Mhm.
be it that you hold yourself back, you have a secret that you won't tell. The thing that you've gone to for comfort is threatening to the person you're looking to, create an attachment with. I mean, that's part of why people have a issue with letting go of an addiction, is they've actually formed some sort of attachment to it that may actually be more secure than with any other person. So it's like, well, you know what? Booze always makes me feel great. That's consistent. When I get drunk, I feel good. And that's more consistent than anything else in my life or anyone. And so stepping back from that is hard because there's something consistent about it. To your point.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to push on. So when we talk about attachment, and think about Velcro and think about marriage as Velcro. Now, Rod, you have a real point that to sell marriage as, well, when you get old and crusty, nobody's going to be there to change your diaper. Not a great image. Not a great image. Although, but when my father wasn't even cold, and my mother looks at me and says, and I'm not getting remarried. And now sometimes I say stuff in videos and my sister rats me out. So sorry, Ma. But what she was, and my sister and I kind of look at her like, where did this come from? We weren't thinking about that at all, Ma. But, and basically she was saying, because she sees she says, I gladly, so my father died suddenly of a heart attack. But if she'd been watching him like a hawk, and I very Dutch anxious for, is he going to have long, slow decline, and is she going to, very practically, she's going to have to care for him. She said, I would have gladly cared for your father no matter how long, but I'm not taking care of some other old man. But part of what marriage is, it's multi-factor, and it's like Velcro. All those little plastic curls have no strength at all. But part of what makes marriage is, well, sometimes she delights you, and sometimes she's just there to help you with the wash, and sometimes she's another income source, and sometimes she's a this, and sometimes she's a that, and that becomes that becomes like Velcro. And when we're talking about attachment, I mean, what attachment we say is that, you know, as a pastor, again, you'll get a call, "Pastor, I need to meet with you right away." And in the back of my mind, because I've done this a few times, is he had a fight with his wife. Had a fight with his wife. And suddenly, you know, and some people, you know, you find some people who, it doesn't matter how bad the fight's going to be, they are not going to say the D word.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, you know, you didn't wipe your shoes when you came on the house. Bang, down it goes. And attachment is basically like Velcro, that there are so many points of contact, and some of those are within the relationship, and a lot of those are outside the relationship, that it makes the contact durable. That's what we're talking about, secure and insecure attachment. And a lot goes into that. And there's just, I mean, part of where science has betrayed us, and perhaps even all of this other all these other psychotechnologies that take us away from real life and sort of bring us up into the atmosphere for one factor at a time. Science looks at the plurality of life and says, we're going to try and do relevance realization down to one thing. Marriage isn't like that, and life isn't like that. And so secure attachment means there's lots of reasons why I stay here. And maybe today I'm staying in this marriage because my wife is hot. And maybe tomorrow I'm staying in this marriage because she cooks okay. And maybe the next day I'm staying in this marriage because, gosh, we got kids. And the cumulative effect of all of that is part of what keeps marriage together. And we talked a little bit about the fact that in many ways, what we have built in terms of the state, and in terms of the urban technological society, and in terms of the safety net, and in terms of all of these things that we've created to alleviate suffering and help the poor, and for all kinds of good reasons, well, do you really need marriage when you've got Social Security? Now, the truth is, yeah, you do, because I see what kind of nursing home Social Security will get you. And I see divorced people in terms of, you know, economics. Boy, two can live, you know, it isn't quite true. Two can live as cheaply as one, but there's truth to it. And all of these factors come together. And if it's, you know, yeah, there's some wobbliness in there, but you've got enough of those little plastic fingers, the attachment will stick, and you're always watching each other. And it's like, okay, I'll stay. It's not sexy and it's not glorious, but because life goes on like this, it does work.
We can't let Paul talk too long about marriage, or no one will do it.
I don't know. I talk to a lot of people, and there's a lot of people who are like, I know you're being kidding, but I'll tell you, I talk to people who are,
you're right.
They're in marriages
right.
that I think I would not want to be in that marriage, but they stay in it, and they stay in it for very real reasons. The marriage is sexless. The people are miserable to live with, but doggone it.
He's doubling down, folks. He's doubling down.
Sorry.
No, I'm totally kidding you. Because of course you're right. You're absolutely right. No, it's I mean, in the sense I'm trying to remind myself to find ways to be optimistic about it, because you kind of know how I feel about it. I think it's in trouble, big trouble, right? But I also want, I'm rooting for it, right? I mean, are we basically saying that marriage is for agreeable, high in openness, generally extroverted, securely attached, you know, essentially emotionally, psychologically healthy? That was basically Scott Adams' point, right? That book I waved around the first conversation, the All or Nothing Marriage, was making the point that, like, whatever, 20%, whatever the number is, there's a fraction of marriages that are great, right? And the people who are doing it well are doing it really well and are loving it, right? It's everyone else who's on the outside of it who has now the freedom to decide whether or not they want to do it or not. They're not doing it, or they're giving it a try and they're walking away from it, right? And so how do we make it so that it's something that's good enough that actually people would want to participate in it, right? And if all it is like, using your mom as an example, she kind of, again, she sort of gave something away when she said that, right? Which is, she would do it for your dad because, all the history, right? You have children together, you have
And
all
she
that
loved him.
together, right? All that, right?
It was a good marriage. I better say
mean-
that.
Doesn't mean she wouldn't be capable of loving somebody else. It's just that if she's making the calculus there, all it's like the spot price in a marketplace. Well, if that's all it is, it's just not enough, because I'm not going to be stuck taking care of somebody else, right? And lots of people are finding themselves at various points in that trajectory where it's just not enough to do it, and so they're just not doing it, right? And so anyway,
And suffering for it. I think because that's why you keep pushing that. You keep trying to sell marriage because you believe in it.
I do think, and maybe one way to think about this is, well, people, there's a whole lot fewer unwanted children out there. One of the sort of potential salutary effects of all of this is, yeah, people aren't getting married just because they have to. They're not having kids because they're supposed to. They're not doing the Kramer versus Kramer thing because that's traumatic to children and you shouldn't do that. So they're just not doing it, right? And the people who love the idea and love family and want to have children, well, they're doing it, right? Remember that article that came out of this, probably 2 or 3 years ago now, before long we'll all be Amish. It was a great article. If I think of it, I'll share it with you, because it was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it was basically making the point, like, they are expanding dramatically. Like, you look at how many there were in, say, 1930 to now, and it's like this explosion of population, because guess what? They have kids, right? And so, sort of a joke, if you just extrapolated their growth rate, before long the whole country will be Amish. Not exactly serious, but makes a point, right? So, one way to think about this is, maybe we're trying to save something that can't be saved for people who don't see why it's worth it. But the result will be that there are people who do see it, and maybe a lot of these are in faith communities, but not necessarily. And they're going to, love each other and have children and bring those children into a world that's optimistic about the project. And, maybe that's what happens, is we just have a lot less, a lot fewer broken and, families and unwanted children.
Well, and I think, to go back to the attachment thing, if you have poor attachment, a marriage is the best place to address that problem, right? If you have somebody who you both can look at each other and be like, look, I got problems, but I'm in it for the long haul. If you're willing to put up with my problems, I'll put up with your problems. We'll try to figure it out. I am going to do my level best to not go anywhere, even if you're a crazy person. And if you can do your level best to not go anywhere, maybe I could start trusting that eventually. And I think if we could both start trusting it, then we've got the best shot we could have in this life of feeling more stable, more secure, which could help us drop the addictions we have, which are making us not capable of saving money, not capable of having a larger friend group, not capable of really investing in the community. I think the attachment piece is a big selling point. And then the other is marriages, like I said in the first conversation, there's so many practical benefits to marriage that I think those speak for themselves. Financially, in terms of social connection, there's a ton of practical benefits.
They don't speak for themselves. They need to be spoken for right now in the culture.
That's true. That's true. Well, you end up earning and saving way more money when you're married than you would even on your own as just a single man or woman. Your children, if you are blessed enough to have them, will be less likely to go to jail, earn more money, have a more stable family themselves, will be less likely to die young. There's tons of benefits for your children. And then long term, it's not just that you have the connection with your spouse, you have the connection with their whole family. And again, maybe you marry somebody and it starts off with like a lot of like, maybe their family isn't so stable. But again, those things can change over time, and you actually have a role in how stable that family becomes. Because you're like, a lot of times when people grieve the loss of a spouse, they also end up grieving the loss of connections that that spouse brought them. And particularly if it's the wife that died, because she tends to be the one that ties them in.
Yeah.
You know, men live a lot longer when they're married. And for women, on the women's side, yeah, you're not going to live longer if you're married to a man, because you tend to live long anyhow. But your children will be significantly more stable, live longer, and more successful if you have their father married to you, or at least really, really involved in the picture. But marriage is best. And so for both sides of the equation, there's a really strong argument to be married. And the thing is, if you're unhappy in your marriage, you're probably going to be unhappy anyways. Like, you think of people, Paul likes his example of like the things that get in your way, right? But there's all these studies. You win the lottery, you're going to be just as happy in 3 years as you were beforehand. You become a paraplegic, you're going to be just as happy in 10 years as you were beforehand. It's unlikely that your marriage is the reason that you're unhappy or happy.
So do we add that to the list? It's for happy people, right?
No, no, it's for all
I'm
people
kidding.
because it's
I'm
better. Okay, I'm like, oh, I
I'm
horribly communicated.
No, happy people will have better marriages. I mean, you're right? Unhappy people, they're going to be unhappy either way. So I guess your point is you're going to be unhappy either way, so you might as well get married.
Yeah, because it actually has the potential to change you as a person, which then you could become the kind of person who could be happy, whether your spouse passes away afterwards or not, because it allows you to work through some of those issues that most relationships don't have the stability to allow you to work through. Because the nice thing in a marriage is Eamon sees all my crap, right? The most powerful things for me in our marriage have been the times where I've lied and then I've had to confess it to him and then he forgives me, or I've mishandled money and then I come shamefaced and I'm like, I ruined this whole thing. And then we work it through. But it's the experiences of being a failure, having moral failures, and making choices that were wrong, not just mistakes, but making the wrong choices, and being loved and not having the relationship fall apart. That's what builds the attachment, because you can be a failure and be loved.
And you are transformed by also being the one who extends that to the other person.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all hinging upon your spouse being incredible and forgiving and all of that. When you extend that, you're transformed. And when you get the opportunity to see how somebody responds to your love and your forgiveness, your mercy, that's powerful too. And maybe they don't change right away. Maybe it's over the course of 5 or 10 or 15 years, but they're transformed by that. I get to see that as well. And again, it's not 100% thing that always happens. Some people do have like the really crappy marriage where the person never sees anything good about them for whatever reason they stay. And it's really difficult always at all times. But I think those are more the exception. I think we end up suffering from collective vicarious trauma from all these terrible stories when and we don't get to hear the beautiful stories as much. And some of it is sometimes people are just not wanting to be rude and be that person who's like, oh, your marriage is really hard, but you know what, mine's great. But we suffer for not hearing the good stories as well. That's where we lose a vision for the beauty.
Well, you guys can vouch for this better than I can, but as I understand it anyway, the literature all points to even the most difficult, hard to treat cases, personality disorders and things like that, having at least one secure attachment in terms of healing and growth is it's the difference maker. Sometimes that's the therapist. Ideally, they have someone in their life who is sturdy and secure that they can count on. I'm not sure you're familiar with this author, but it's worth a recommendation to the audience. Stan Tatkin, who he wrote a book Wired for Love, and he's written a couple of others as well.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, he's like he's a, I think he's a psychologist, maybe like a neuroscientist psychologist, like more focused on the neuroscience. But his basic premise is kind of the stuff we're talking about in terms of attachment, which is how deeply biological our need for attachment is. It's that it really is in our makeup as a species. All you have to do is just watch primates at a zoo and just watch them like constantly grooming each other, and like they're just touching each other constantly, right? There's just all of this essentially soothing going on, right? And his point is that, kind of like, I'm giving Paul a hard time for this, but he sort of makes a similar point, which is that when you marry somebody, you're taking on their burdens. Like he doesn't put a shine on it. Like the act of taking on another person is to take on their burdens. Of course, they're doing the same for you, right? And so he goes into like having little rituals, like always making sure that when when one of you gets home after the other, that you have a greeting ritual that you do at the door, like lots of little things you do to sort of kind of ritualize your relationship, all under the sort of umbrella of that this is essentially in our nature, right? This is like, we need this, right? And anyway, I recommend him as an author. I remember one of his books, Wired for Love. I think there are one or two others as well, but he goes into the kind of science of what you're talking about in terms of attachment.
Well, you think how different it would be if the conversations were less about like, well, if you work out, certain number of days of the week, you're going to be a lot more attracted to women. You're going to have more sex than if it was, you work on yourself so that you can be someone that has secure attachment and could be a secure source of attachment for other people. Because essentially, without any of the psychological knowledge, that's what my dad did when his goal of stability, right? Well, that would be really radically different if we took what we knew about attachment and we had that somewhere up higher in the hierarchy of our professional ethics as psychologists. How would that transform the field of psychology? I think that the tools are there and the understanding is there. It's where is our attention? And that's where this idea of, it being a marketplace, first and foremost, I think is just so damaging right out of the gate. Not that those elements are not important. You should be thinking about attractiveness and understand those things. But when that's the framing and that's at the top, that's insecure attachment and being choosy all over the place, right? That's you're set up for that.
Jordan
So
Peterson's.
can we sell marriage, Rod, as is it sexy enough that people become the kind of person that can Velcro sell marriage? Is Velcro sexy enough?
Well, I like my little vignettes that makes me think of this. There are a lot of things that we know that we don't necessarily want to admit we know when particularly if we're talking publicly about things that are delicate, right? For example, do any of us really doubt that if the studies were done, that probably the single most predictive factor in thriving in adulthood for children is lots and lots and lots of access to loving parents whenever they need it, essentially. So we instead pluck them from their mother's arms. Maybe we give her 6 weeks of maternity leave and then she's back to the mines, and we're going to hand that infant to a Central American immigrant and just hope for the best.
Probably do it better.
Fair point. Yeah, this is not a comment on Central American immigrants at all. This is a comment on it's not their mother, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably in the room with lots of other children who have needs as well, right?
Yeah.
Just the idea that your parents are around, that you can access them if you need them, right? Does anybody really doubt that those kids are going to grow up a lot more securely attached?
Yeah.
But if you say that, you just lob some kryptonite into the entire business model that is a two-income family, right? Here's one. So let's say we have two children born on exactly the same day. For the purposes of this little vignette, they're identical in every way. There's only one difference, which is the conditions under which that they came into the world. In one case, their mother and father met when they were in kindergarten, grew up together in a small village. They've known each other their entire lives. All their families have known each other. And they were mostly friends as children. And there was this point when they went off to college and came home for Thanksgiving or Christmas that there was a spark. Something had changed. And suddenly there was an attraction. And they started, at first quite quietly dating. And then the word spreads among the village that these two have, and just imagine the rejoicing that happens when the village
Mhm.
learns that these two are beginning to fall in love with each other. And then imagine that wedding. And then imagine that child being born to those parents. And imagine that child walking the streets of that village, knowing its entire story and hearing over and over and over again all the stories about when mom and dad were kindergartners and the way they used to play, right? The other child, again, identical in every way, born on the same day. But this was, in this case, the child's mother was going through a really difficult breakup. And to help just get over it, she was, maybe doing a lot of partying, and she honestly doesn't know which man it was that that caused her to conceive a child. And maybe she just chose the one that seemed most responsible in terms of assigning, heritage to it. And this child, comes into the world, not ever really knowing who his father or her father was. The mother is as loving as any mother can be. We're not trying to shame this mother. This is just a very different set of circumstances. Do any of us doubt which child has a better chance to thrive in adulthood? We know these things, right? But to say them has us tripping over all sorts of things that we're not comfortable talking about. And so selling marriage, Paul, it's essentially, as I said in my little piece, it's essentially you're orienting toward the future. You have to care about the future in order to care about marriage,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
you can see a world where people come into that world knowing they're loved and wanted, and knowing that their parents love each other, and maybe once in a while they see, dad kind of, smacks his wife on the butt when he doesn't think anybody's watching. Like they see a little like, ooh, something else is going on between mom and dad, right? Like it's a mystery, but it's also kind of a beautiful kind of mystery, right? Oh, there's something else. There's a spark. There's attraction, right? There's affection. Dad is modeling a certain kind of way of being a father, and mom is modeling a certain way of being a mother. And there's overlap there, but right, we all instinctively recognize that those kids are going to thrive, or are they're more likely to thrive, let's say, in adulthood. But we have a hard time talking about it.
I totally agree with you. And I think that part of what makes it hard for us to talk about it is because we can be so black and white, that it can feel like, well, there's this ideal marriage and this ideal family. And if we can't get to that point, then it's just all a failure. And so if we don't have that idealized state, then it's a failure, but we don't want it to be a failure. So let's say that idealized state doesn't matter and everybody should just try their best. And we just won't worry about that idealized state because we don't want to then not try. So to keep people from not trying, we won't have the goal to which they could achieve. And so this is a little bit of a tangent, but hopefully it tracks. One of the things, so when I was a young mom, it was really, really hard. I didn't have the family supports that I needed. I had a lot of postpartum depression, and it was really hard. It was an unexpected pregnancy. I wanted to wait 8 years. I wanted to finish all my school. I had plans. They all got wiped out. And it was just hard. And then the babies kept coming and it kept getting harder. And I had a lot of anxiety and shame about my ability as a mom. Because it was just so challenging. And it was like, you can imagine this idealized state. Like, this is the way it should be when you're a mom. You should spend all this one-on-one time, and how many books should you read, and how much playtime should they have with other kids, and what is the nutritional quality of the food that they're getting, and how consistent is their schedule. And there's all these, like, with the list of expectations as a mom. But one of the things I found so comforting was I was working on an assignment, and I was doing some research. I can't remember what the book was, but there's this study on motherhood and the good enough mom. And there's all this research that you basically had two categories of kids. You had kids where their moms were good enough, and the kids where their moms weren't good enough. And the moms who weren't good enough moms were the ones who didn't spend time with their kids, and they didn't read to their kids, and they didn't really care about the nutritional quality of their kids' food and all of that stuff. But there was a threshold where you were a good enough mom. And after that threshold, it didn't matter how much attention and time extra you paid, it was still going to be good enough. So it was kind of like you had to get like 60% of the way there.
Sort of like on the grading scale, D for done.
D for done. Yeah. You had to get to good enough.
You passed.
But anywhere between good enough and amazing, there was no outcome difference for kids. And I found so much comfort because I was like,
Or little. There was difference, but not. It
was
wasn't.
minimal.
It wasn't devastating.
It was a
Something-
minimal difference.
Yeah.
But I found it so comforting because I was like, I can't be convinced at this point that I'm a good mom, but I think I'm a good enough mom. I think I'm a good enough mom. Well, thank you, honey. But at the time it was hard for me to maybe see things that way, but I could say it's good enough. And I think it's something similar with this, where it's like, you don't have to shoot for the perfect marriage. There's the good enough marriage. There's the good enough attachment. And if we can, instead of having it be black and white, where it's like, well, either I can make sure that, we have this perfect ideal, and anything less than that is just a waste. Why bother? Don't get married. Don't have kids. It's like, yeah, that's maybe the ideal. You're shooting a little high. But if you can shoot for, if it's good enough, it'll be better. And you will be able to achieve these goals. You will get more attached. You will be more secure. You will be able to, fill in the blank, even if it's not that ideal state. I think sometimes bringing the goal down allows you to still have a goal.
And stability psychologically, right, is being able to incorporate both positive and negative. It's the term, right, is splitting. When it's all one way or another, and if you're splitting, you're going to have instability in your understanding of self and of others. And if you split, you're not going to be oriented to reality. But if you can incorporate positive and negative, the good and the bad, and hey, it's okay. That doesn't mean that you don't try to work on things. It doesn't mean that you're horrible. It means you're okay. That's all right. Everyone has some things to work on. You're going to be a psychologically stable person, and your relationships with other people, you'll be able to handle somebody criticizing you, and it'll be all right. And you also will be offended if somebody's really, really rude to you, and that's probably about where you should be. And that's where it's interesting. I guess there's different psychological profiles for things like. I think I was thinking, I was like, I wanted to clarify my dad's comment about find a woman with a knock against her. So does it sound like some sort of predatory thing where it's like, look for the weak ones? That it came from more a place of like, okay, he's very open about, he has his stuff, and it's like, find somebody who knows a bit who they are, and they know that they're not perfect and have wrestled with that and accepted that. And I think that's the danger on, like, when I hear people who are most traumatized from like church, it's ones who got that message of like, you're just horrible, you're awful, which I think is really a warped version of total depravity, because total depravity as a doctrine is not that everyone's as bad as they could be all the time. It touches every part of you, and thankfully nobody's as bad as they could be. But you have to reckon with that it's there. So that's what's his point, and that's how I see it being so dangerous if you get either that message that you're just horrible, or I think equally as damaging is that you're great, you are fantastic, you are just the best person on earth, you're brilliant and you're gorgeous. And it's like, well, okay, how's that person going to do when they meet reality? And we do this going back and forth. I guess that's why I think your functional anthropology has to be able to take in and integrate the good and the bad of human nature, because then you're equipped to be able to look at another person and say, yeah, you're going to have your bad days, and sometimes I'm going to be a jerk, but that's not who I am. That doesn't define you, and you're going to be great. But you know what? There's going to be days where you're not fantastic. So I'm not going on a roller coaster up and down with who you are, or that terribly surprised by my own failings. And I think we set people up really for a lot of failure by not being realistic about the good and the bad, and praise the good when it's there, and we'll reckon with the not so great when it presents itself as well. And that's where I think in a marriage you get that secure attachment, is when, like Catherine was saying, the other person sees all your stuff, and they really see your stuff, and they're still there, and they don't split in their understanding of who you are. And maybe you don't begin with that, but you can certainly work your way towards it with somebody who you're in a covenant with, I think.
And then I think that creates space for what you were saying, Rod, where we need to be able to say it's better to have this ideal where the kids are with the family, where the kids are with their mother when they're small, where we can have that conversation, I think, when we can pull the pressure off of it and say, and if you don't hit that ideal itself, moving in that direction is better. And so that's why I was shifting over to that, to say, I agree with you, Rod. It's hard to have those conversations because it can get this polarizing feeling. It's like, oh, I put my kids in daycare, so what? I'm a failure. My wife is a screw up. Our kids are. It's like, no, like, let's not go crazy. But there is an ideal, and the closer we can move towards that for some goals, the better. And we can talk about that without demonizing or shaming people who haven't either had the option or made that choice for some reason. You don't have to opt out of the conversation because you're immediately overwhelmed or offended by that. Which I think.
I remember The Good Enough Mother. Yeah, you might say it's a nuanced thing, right? Like, ideals function in a way, but most of us never achieve them, right? But they still have value, right? I remember The Good Enough Mother, and maybe another way of describing that would be something like a mother who cares. It's a very vague term, but it kind of captures a lot of things, right? Like, you kind of know, particularly as if you get to adulthood and you reflect back, you kind of know if your mother cared about you or not, right? And a mother who didn't care about you, that just really hurts, right? Like, nobody's going to love you like your mother. And if she didn't, like, you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to fill that hole, right? Like, it's so in a sense, she can get a lot of things wrong, but if she just loves her kids, she just cares, within reason, they're probably going to do okay, right? And maybe to your point, to take that same idea and apply it to marriage, you want to be with somebody who cares about you, right? And like, you want to care about them, right? And we're saying that like it's obvious, because we kind of know what we mean when we say it. But in a sense, that's why so many people are so lost, is that how do I find my way to where I would care about a person enough that I'd make those kind of sacrifices for them? And could they possibly care about me with all my, shortcomings, right? And if there's any advice in here for people who are on the outside looking in, trying to figure out like, where would you start? One of the things that I say a lot to, particularly people who are, say, in my stage of life, that, I encounter a lot of people who are single still in their, sort of second half of their life. And they've essentially given up right? And I feel so sad for them, you know, because it's just, it's so, their loneliness sort of drips off of them, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, you want to be able to say something that doesn't hurt, you know, you want to be encouraging. But the advice I try to give, if I can sort of find my way into that conversation, is as much as you can, try to be honest with people. Like, try to describe how lonely you are. You know, maybe you don't do that the very first time you meet somebody, but you know, like, be vulnerable, find your way into that conversation where you don't pretend to have it all figured out. You're doing great, you got this great life and everything's going fine. Like, no, like admit, like, you know, it's just not, it's kind of empty without somebody to share it with. If that's not true for you, we'll find that this doesn't apply, right? I'm talking about the people who have a longing for connection. Try to find a way to develop a vocabulary and a language around vulnerability, and give people an opportunity to find a way in, kind of to the point earlier, Paul, where I really do think that a lot of women don't understand this about a lot of men. And I'm not speaking for all men here, but I do think I'm speaking for a lot of men, which is that feeling he gets when he begins to love her, to fall in love with her, is highly correlated to where he sees his way in. He sees how she needs him, right? And something happens and he softens and he starts to care about her. He starts to want to, you know, make sacrifices for her, to share, you know, his resources with her, to look up, you know, stand up for her. And if she's just fine, thank you very much, he's like, okay, I mean, we're all good here, right? And he doesn't engage because he doesn't have anything to engage with, right? So I guess if there is any advice there, it would be something like, you know, try to find people who show that they care, and try to be the kind of person who cares, because that probably is enough.
But what you said, Rod, is deeply countercultural, because if you watch enough TV, it's strong, independent woman. I mean, this is like strong and independent is next to godliness here in our culture. And you know, oh, but I still want to be the kind of person that I still want guys to open the door. And it's kind of like, you know, you're gonna have to show a little vulnerability and need, not too much, you know, again, you know, let's, you know, mutual disclosure is the path to love. But I mean, culturally we are in a corner of our own making. We're, in some ways, we're victims of our success. I mean, we have wanted to have social safety nets that could replace the very complex safety nets that extended families are. But as always, those two things aren't the same, and there's upsides and downsides. But go ahead.
And not to, I mean, I might be wrong, but you see how the feminine spirit has taken over so much of Western culture. And then you have to think, well, but what was the curse for women, right? It was that her desire would be for her husband and she wouldn't have it. And you can kind of read that a couple ways. One is that she would want to be like him. She would want to be the masculine, and it wouldn't work out. And one would be she'd want his attention, and it wouldn't work out. And we're getting both of those things in our culture. You have what we started the conversation with, the women doing more of the putting on the fancy clothes and the makeup and trying to get the attention. But then you also have women saying, well, forget men and I'll just be a man myself and I'll be a strong, independent woman and forget the feminine. We don't need the feminine. And so this is, I say, you know, maybe you ignore this just because it's a little more philosophical, maybe less functionally you can do much about it. But it seems to me that if our society has become more feminine in its approach, or maybe not feminine, female, I don't know. You've got that feminine spirit where it's more compassionate, more focused on social connections, more leaning in that direction. You also get what comes with that, which is this struggle with the masculine.
It's a weird chimera, though, because at the same time, it's impersonal. It's an impersonal compassion from the state and government policy. So in a way, it's feminine on the surface, maybe, but the experience is not one of feminine concern and care and embrace and warmth, which I mean, I think the world can be very cold, and in one sense, what it desperately needs actually is the true feminine to inhabit, and not the knockoff or the surface version of it, or the institutionalized version, because you can't be institutional and really personal at the same time. And I think the feminine warmth, when it's in the feminine spirit, when it's at its most powerful, I think is when it's in the personal.
Well, I don't think you can have a feminine institution.
Yeah.
Right? Like the institutional is the masculine. And so I don't think you can have it. I think if you try to do that, that's when it gets twisted.
Yeah, because you have the institution, you have the feminine spirit inhabiting it, the people who are within it at that personal level.
I'm almost done watching. Rod, this is not the stuff you want to watch. On HBO Max, they have a documentary out a couple of years ago called The Vow, about the Nexium group. And I mean, so many of these issues many of these people were high achieving people. And so then they have these men's groups, and then they have these women's groups. And what was interesting was that it was just laden with psychology. It's just laden with cultural values. And then it, winds up being at least good part of it winds up devolving into a sex cult. And, it was just.
You sure I won't like this?
It isn't a sexy documentary. It's not that kind of thing. But it was masterfully done. And because the way the presentation, I've yet to see a documentary that the process and the disclosure of the documentary was just so dialed in to kind of help the viewer walk through the levels and how this thing became what it was. But all of these issues, the masculine and the feminine, and we're up to our neck in these things. And what was interesting was that for some of the early whistleblowers, it was really marriage that saved them.
Mm.
And those who weren't married were much more easily victimized by what was happening in the group. Because suddenly, as with marriage, you've got two heads and there's a strong attachment. And that cult really tested the attachment of these people. But in both cases of four of the key, very early whistleblowers who were deep in the organization, they could not both be in a sex cult and a marriage. Those two things don't go together.
One hopes.
I think we alluded to this last time, and we haven't yet gotten to it. But a much more thorough discussion about the masculine and the feminine, I think, is a worthy pursuit. There's so much there, and some great. There's a lot of great books and a lot of great thought about it. It's again another hard thing to talk about in public. Masculinity versus the masculine, femininity versus the feminine, right? that we each have both, all of us have both within us, right? These ideas around the words we're using, order and chaos. Peterson got in trouble for that by equating those to masculinity and femininity. But I think it was David Data. He wrote a book that's more than 10 years ago now, but he had a concept of it that I always liked, which was the masculine is all the things in your nature that stay the same, and the feminine is all the things that change. So like if you can like imagine your very, very, very earliest memories going all the way back to like the very first memories you have, like the sense of the you that is uniquely you, that has always been you, that is something like the innate masculine that you have within you. And then it's all the things that change. It's the seasons, it's the cycles, it's gaining weight, losing weight. It's all the things that happen that change is the feminine. Is another way to think about it, sort of take it out of the realm of like male and female or masculinity and femininity, right? It's just this idea, and Peterson used order and chaos to accomplish it, yin and yang, right? There's lots of different ways to talk about it. But I do think that a revival, and maybe we've talked about this already, I can't remember if we have, but you see this in the Latin cultures where there's a lot more of a polarity between the masculine and the feminine, and you just don't see you don't see the angst and the neurosis around this. There's just a much more healthy flow, and it seems to really work for them culturally. And so it does seem like a discussion. I don't know if we can do it justice, but there's a lot there, I think.
We probably can't do it justice, but I think it's worth trying.
Yeah.
Just to put my cards on the table, I know we don't have much more time, but I think that the best framing of it is that the feminine as the ocean, the masculine as the land, and that when you bring those together, either of those is barren on its own. It's empty, right? Like the ocean, it's just, maybe there's monsters in it, but there's not human life in there. And the masculine without water is just the desert. And so when you bring them together in the way that they should be brought together, then you can have a garden. And so the ideal, it's not that you have, one is bad, one is good. It's the proper integration of them, where they don't become a single thing, but they pull out more out of the other than you could either on its own, like you said, within yourself, and then obviously within the extending circles of relationships too. So.
I do think it's a little interesting that last time Catherine sold us on settled, and this time she's selling us on good enough. And I just I know I'm the one who goes dark on this stuff, but really that's what Catherine's doing. Just saying.
But
that's because settled and good enough is good. It's not bad.
Well, and I'll tell you this, I think this does go to another thing we could get into. There's a relationship is at least two people, but it does involve individuals. And this is, I guess, it's just something about me, I suppose. I never felt offended by it. Like she was settling for me. It's not in my nature, I guess, to be like, oh, well, I mean, if she was like, well, you're my project to work on, I would have been offended by that.
You're the goat or the chicken.
Yeah.
you're not the meat in the supermarket. No, I'm following the metaphors here.
Yeah, but Eamon, the context is important. You guys are both young, right? It'd be different if you were 35, right?
Yeah.
And 10 or 15 years later, you'd have a different take on this, I think.
I would. And I think there are also some personality differences where I think there's weaknesses that come with my personality. I know that Catherine can tell you a lot about that. She's talking about settled and everything as well. There's something about fundamentally how we understand relationships to unfold, how they unfold, that is separate from us. I mean, our self-concept is never individual, it's never atomized. Our self-concept comes from other people and how they treat us and view us. And there are bridges that are easier or more difficult, I think, to cross, about accepting faults and limitations that are contingent upon messages you receive from other people. And I think being around some people where they didn't feel like they were awful, but they were also like very much like, you know, hey, yeah, you think I'm terrible? Well, I can tell you some things that are really bad about me if you want. That made it really okay, I guess. I think I'm somebody who's generally has struggled with self-confidence in different ways. And Catherine was a significant part of me feeling like I could accomplish a lot more in my life than I did prior to her. And yeah, I think there's a lot there about messages we take from our family, what's modeled for us, and how we even enter into a relationship as a conduit. And so I think we have different hurdles to entering into that. And I think that there are, in many ways, there's a billion different ways to do that. In other ways, I'm like, yeah, there's probably like 3 or 4 typical bridges that people have to cross. Not one necessarily better than the other, but are important to reckon with. And I think it does come down to a lot of these attachment styles, and that affects us considerably. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation for another day, I guess.
We're talking on the internet about marriage, and every once in a while we'll kind of weave in a little bit of our personal story, and those, I think, are the best parts, even though obviously we do it carefully, but I do think those are the best parts.
Yeah.
All right. I sense we are ready to land the plane here. Do we say one love?
Yeah.
That's Freddie's.
That's Freddie's. We're not gonna Freddie left me hanging last week, but so I will stop the recording, and then we can talk about dates. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right.